Thank you very much, Mr. Bradick. All right, good Sabbath to everyone. And I appreciate that reading, and I think after going through that and also reading it prior, there's several sermons in that reading. I should have probably chosen a different subject, but I already kind of had this subject in mind based upon something that was mentioned in our question and answer period a couple of weeks ago. You know, the German people have played a significant role in the pages of modern history. But have they played a significant role in the pages of ancient history? We see that the German people of today, they have produced wonderful composers such as Bach and Beethoven, Brahms, Handel, and others. Germany, although, is also known for 2 world wars that has caused the death of some 90 million people, with casualties actually reaching a far higher number. And so when we consider the significance of this country, Germany, and those people, albeit widely notorious, I think, the accomplishments, does the Bible tell us anything about such a significant people, such as the Germans? Do they play a role in end-time events? And where did, in fact, the German people come from? You know, some of us may have studied this in the past. I know I have. Some of us may have forgotten this information, which I think was indicated in the Q&A last week. So I'm going to answer some of these questions, or at least attempt to today. Let's go over to Genesis in chapter 10. Genesis 10. Because in order to begin to understand who the German people are, we need to first recognize that the Bible documents the beginning of many nations and tribes. And the genealogies that we find in Genesis 10 as well as in chapter 11, they help us to know where many of these nations began and from where they came. And so combined with the prophecies that we find throughout the scriptures, we can also see where some of these nations or people are headed. For example, the descendants of Jacob are found among many of the nations around the world today, such as Denmark and France, America, Israel, Australia, Great Britain, and others. But such nations, or at least the titles that we know today that I had just mentioned, except for Israel, they're not called by modern names like that in the scriptures. Instead, God will often use the name of origin, such as Jacob or Israel, Ephraim or Manasseh or Judah. And this pattern is used regarding Gentile nations as well. And so prophecies of ungodly people are found in the scriptures, but they are not referred to as the modern nations we might know of today. Instead, we see them referred to as Babylon, or Gog and Magog, or Nineveh, Assyria, Edom, Moab, and others. And then there are occasions when these nations are symbolized by beasts or by an image, such as in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And so nations like Iran, Iraq, or Pakistan, and so many of the others around the world, they are not found in the scriptures by that name, but they are referred to instead as Esau, who is the father of the Arab nations, or king of the south when it comes to prophecy. And so this is also the case when it comes to the Germanic people, because a nation that is as noteworthy as the nation of Germany, we find that they are actually mentioned in the scriptures, but not like the names we might think of, like the Deutsch, which is what Germans call themselves, Deutschland, the Franks, or the Goths, or the Germans. And so who then are the forefathers of the German people, and what role do they play in end-time events? Well, these are some questions that I hope that we will answer today. Because it's understood, to begin, it's understood by believers and non-believers alike that Mesopotamia is the cradle of civilization. And it's this area that's located throughout much of Iraq and all the way down into Kuwait, that this is north and south of the great Euphrates River, which was much larger even at one time. The oldest of human artifacts comes from this area that's referred to as Mesopotamia. But surprisingly, or at least not to us, but surprisingly to unbelievers, what archaeologists have found is that when they examine the record, the evidence of people in this first known societies here, that the civilizations did not begin primitive. That what they find is that there is a sudden, all of a sudden, just a sudden evidence of sophistication and technology even, and ingenuity. And so early man was not trying to figure out how a wheel works using sticks and bones. Instead, early man was very inventive and industrious. So north of modern-day Iraq, which is Mesopotamia, is the mountains of Ararat. And this is found in the country known as Armenia today. And this is where Noah's Ark set down, in the mountains of Ararat. Not necessarily on Mount Ararat, but the scriptures say the mountains of Ararat. So the mountains around this area. And so Noah and his children set up home in this place after the ark had landed. And it is from this area that his children began to repopulate the earth. And so many of Noah's descendants, therefore, migrated south down into the region that we refer to as Mesopotamia. And the Bible tells us that Ham's descendants, in chapter 10, that his descendants, they included Cush. And Cush, we understand, is the father of Nimrod. And Nimrod began the infamous kingdom of Babel. And then there are two psalms, actually. Psalm, if you want to make note of it, you can look it up later, Psalm 78 and also Psalm 105, that also indicate that Ham's descendants began the nation of Egypt. It calls Egypt the land of Ham. So Ham and his children, I think, for the most part, have an infamous history, and I think would give credit to the theory that Ham likely married Naamah, which is one of Lamech's daughter, and actually brought her through the flood, and this couple reignited idolatry after the flood. But that, of course, is a theory, although there is some evidence to indicate that, and that's also another story. But there are other grandchildren of Noah, though, that are nearly as infamous as Nimrod. For example, Noah's son Shem, he had a son who was an uncle to Nimrod, and this uncle of Nimrod, his name was Asshur. In chapter 10 of Genesis, in verse 22, the sons of Shem were Elam, Asshur, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. So Asshur is also known as Assur, and depending on your translation, it might be spelled with an H or the H might be left out. But in any case, Assur is the father of the Assyrians, the empire of Assyria. Now, interestingly, the New King James Version of the Bible, in verse 11 of this same chapter, it states, speaking of Nimrod, it introduces Nimrod, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, in verse 10. And then in verse 11 it says, from that land he went to Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth, and Calah. Well, Assyria wouldn't have had that name yet, of course, but we know that the author who documented this wrote at a later time, and so Moses would have been documenting areas that were known in his day, so that people would understand, oh yeah, I know where Assyria is at, so they would know where Syria and also where Nineveh was located. But interestingly, the King James Version of this verse, verse 11, says that out of that land went forth Assur and builded Nineveh and the city of Rehoboth and Calah. So it's debated. The only reason I mention is because there can be a slightly different interpretation of this, that, you know, it could be that Nimrod built Nineveh, or it could be that Assur built Nineveh, or what I think is more likely, they're contemporary. You know, they're related. He's an uncle of Nimrod. I think it's likely that this was a combined effort between the two. But nonetheless, we do know that Nineveh became a chief city of the Assyrians. And because of their mingling at this time, the Bible, I think, but the Bible does speak of Assyria and Babylon in the same context quite frequently, especially when it comes to prophecy. So Josephus, he confirms this, of course, not that we need his confirmation, but Josephus confirmed the heritage of Assyria being connected to Nineveh, and he wrote in his Antiquities of the Jews that Asshur lived at the city of Nineveh, and he named his subjects Assyrians, who became the most fortunate nation beyond others. Now, the fortune that Asshur and the Assyrians amassed was not because God was blessing these people. It actually was because of their brutal force and their conquering. The Assyrian armies became well known for their vicious methods of warfare and terrorist torture-like techniques that they used. And I won't go into any of the details, but I've read about some of these, and it's horrific, some of the things that the Assyrians did in their warfare and conquering. Now notice, if you will, if you look at chapter 11 of Genesis, and beginning in verse 10, and I'm not going to read through it, but just look at it for a moment, because this, we saw about Shem's descendants in chapter 10, but this in chapter 11, verse 10, gives another account of Shem's descendants, but it omits Asshur. It omits Elam, Lud, and Aram. And the reason of this is because chapter 10 gives us a genealogy indicating a beginning and a division of the nations. And this means that the different choices that these descendants of Noah's sons made while developing different cultures and religions. And this caused them to be not united, but divided, although they were united for a time before the Tower of Babel was destroyed by God. But look at this in verse 31 and 32 of chapter 10. When it sums up the genealogy that's given in chapter 10, it says, "These were the sons of Shem according to their families, according to their languages, in their lands, according to their nations." So that's why the genealogy is given. And then it continues to say, "These were the families of the sons of Noah, according to their generations, in their nations. And from these, the nations were divided on the earth after the flood." And so before even talking about the Tower of Babel, it begins to indicate that there was a type of division among the people. Nimrod united a lot of these ungodly people and began building the Tower of Babel, which I believe was in a way threatening God's timetable, which is why he confounded the language down in that area and said, there's nothing that's going to be left restrained from them to do. He wasn't concerned about them reaching heaven and overtaking heaven. He was concerned about something else, a bigger plan that he had for humanity. But in any case, in chapter 11, we proceed to have a genealogy of Shem and individuals that lead to the birth of Abraham. And it begins in verse 10, talking about Shem, Noah's son. But then 8 generations later, in verse 26, we see now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So Shem's descendants, through his son Arphaxad, which would give birth to Abram, or Abraham, who became a father of the faithful people of God, a faithful nation of Hebrews. And so Abraham's birth was around 300 years after Asshur. 300 years later. That's a long time. Look what's happened in the country of America just in 200 plus years. A long time had passed between the birth of Asshur and the development of the Assyrians and Abraham. And so Asshur had become a significant people in northern Mesopotamia during that time. In fact, Josephus states that the 4 kings that attacked Sodom and Gomorrah, that's documented in Genesis 14, that took Lot, Abraham's nephew, as a captive, Josephus says that these 4 kings included leaders of the Assyrian people. And if you read that, you can see it obviously includes a leader of the Babylonian people, saying that he was a king of Shinar, which is a region that was under Babylon's or Babel's rule. And Josephus, he also speculated that God fighting with Abraham at that time, and Abraham being able to destroy some of these kings and those people, that situation actually kept the Assyrian Empire at bay so that the Egyptian Empire would develop and be the dominating empire in the region for 1,000 years or more. So during the time of Egypt's dominance, still Assyria did grow. They continued to become larger and stronger and apparently more wicked. Now, there's something else that I found interesting during this study, which is sort of an aside, but it definitely is related. And that Ham, he seems to be the father of a great many ungodly people. His descendants actually include the Philistines, the Babylonians, and a number of Canaanite tribes that Israel was told to drive out of the Promised Land during Joshua's conquests and afterwards. But one of these tribes is known as the Hittites. And the Hittites are the sons of Heth. And Heth was a grandson of Ham. Heth was also a first cousin to Nimrod. So the sons of Heth became the Hittites of Canaan. But the reason I mention this is because in 1 Kings in chapter 10 and also 2 Kings in chapter 7, and I can give you the exact scriptures if you like, 1 Kings 10:29, 2 Kings 7 and verse 6, these two verses speak of kings of the Hittites and also of an army of Syria. Now, all scholars agree that the Hittites mentioned in those two scriptures are not the sons of Heth. They are not the same Hittites of the land of Canaan. Scholar Herman Hay, Church of God member, he wrote an article on this subject where he discovered that the kings of the Hittites mentioned in those two scriptures that I had just mentioned, that these kings were kings to a tribe known as Hate or Kate, and the kings called themselves, the kings of this Hate or Kate people, they called themselves Katesars, meaning kaisers of Hittites, or the Hatti. And so obviously we see the similarity between Katesars and kaisers, and I think this leads credence to this pointing to the German people who later would call their emperors and their kings kaisers. And it's believed that, of course, they are the kings of Hate, and then therefore descendants of the Assyrian people, the forefathers of the Assyrian people. But where are the Assyrians today? Is it truly the German people? Is there more evidence? Because it can be somewhat obscure to some of us. Well, we do know that the northern tribes, of course, we know that they were conquered by Assyria. This was a form of judgment against those people because of their iniquity, continuous, if you will, iniquity against God. He did give them chance after chance after chance to repent, but they did not. And the book of Hosea gives a scathing rebuke toward the house of Israel because of their wickedness, and also gives details regarding the destruction of the northern kingdom. Now, the survivors of the northern tribes were taken captive to Assyria in the north. And in this place, the northern tribes, most of them, became lost to history. Most people refer to them today as the lost tribes of Israel. And part of this reason, I suggest, that the northern tribes became lost to history, supposedly, although we have been able to track some of them now, but part of the reason is because the Assyrians were also vastly lost to history, weren't they? Or were they? All historians agree that northern Iraq and the area of Syria were once inhabited by these people, this empire of Assyria. And because the inhabitants in these two places has widely been Arabs for the last 1,800 years or somewhere in that ballpark, many believe that Arabs are the descendants of Assyria and Babylon. In fact, there are people living in those places today who claim that they are the children of the Assyrian Empire and or the Babylonians. But this can't be true for several reasons. And the most obvious reason comes through the examination of the archaeological record. because the chief cities of Assyria and also of Babylon, they were laid waste, covered in dirt and sand for centuries. And so the destruction of Nineveh was also so thorough that for nearly 200 years or longer, hundreds of years, people actually thought that the stories about Nineveh were myth because there was no evidence that it even existed. And it wasn't until the 1800s that some of these places began to be uncovered. And then they found, oh, this is Nineveh, the great city of Nineveh that we've heard so much about. It was rediscovered. And so the people of Assyria and Babylon that once inhabited those areas, they were long gone before the Arabs came in and conquered and migrated into what is vastly a desolate region of that they call their homeland. But where did the Assyrians go? Where did they go? Well, to this we can look to a few documents of secular history, and that's why they have vastly been lost, because many other people and nations have many more documents supporting where they had gone, where they migrated to, who they became. But the Assyrians and the lost tribes of Israel, not so much. But there is evidence. And a few of the documents I'm going to mention very briefly have been overlooked and discounted by historians because they seem like, well, there's just not, we need more evidence, we need more supporting evidence. But one of them was an ancient Greek topographer, and he wrote what was called a periplus. And these were fairly common documents of the time. A periplus is basically a document listing ports and coastal landmarks. The Periplus of Silax was believed to have been written somewhere around 500 BC, but they're not sure because what we have today is a copy of the original, and it was written somewhere around 300 BC. But it states this in the Periplus, when it's talking about the area around the Black Sea, it says the coast of the Black Sea is called Assyria. Well, you know, this would have been a good sermon actually to have a PowerPoint. I just didn't have time to put together, because if you look at a map and you look at the coast of the Black Sea, it's about 300 to 500 miles away from the Assyrian Empire, the headquarters there. So this would mean that the populace of Assyria, after the empire was dissolved, that they migrated some 500 miles north toward the Black Sea. Hundreds of years later, after this historian wrote this Periplus, there's another historian by the name of Diodorus. He was a Greek historian, and he wrote that Assyria was a large colony in northern Asia Minor on the south side of the Black Sea. So here we have a second witness to where Assyria was found, long after the empire had seemed to have vanished. But the migration continued. Another historian named Pliny the Elder, he lived during the time of the New Testament church under the leadership of the apostles. And he wrote this. He said that a warlike people called the Assyrians inhabited the north of the Black Sea. So now we see them have migrated across the Black Sea into the north. And he also had documented, he said that there was an Assyriani tribe, which would have been one of the tribes of those people, that could be found among the Scythian people in Crimea. And Crimea, as we are aware, is a large area that is north of the Black Sea. But the migration of the Assyrian people did not stop there. They continued to move north and west into Europe, along with many of the lost tribes of Israel, who, through the efforts of Mr. Armstrong and others, we understand, came to be people of Denmark, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Great Britain, and others. The ancient historian Jerome, he wrote in the 3rd century AD, so some close to 300 years, 200 to 300 years after Pliny the Elder, he wrote this about various tribes that were conquering large portions of Europe and threatening the empire of Rome at that time. And he said this, I quote, "Savage tribes in countless numbers have overrun all parts of Gaul." And Gaul is a term that it refers to a large region of Western Europe that was under the rule of the Roman Empire between the 1st and 5th centuries. But he continues to say the whole country between the Alps and the Pyrenees, between the Rhine and the ocean has been laid waste by hordes of Quadae, Vandals, Sarmatians, Alans, Gepids, Hurls, Saxons, Burgundians, Alumni, and alas, he said, for the Commonwealth, even Pannonians. And then he says this, for Assur is joined with them. Interesting, isn't it? Jerome actually seems to be quoting, he may have been quoting, and nobody knows for sure, but it seems that he was quoting Psalm 83:8, which we will turn to at the end of this sermon, because Psalm 83:8 is a prophetic psalm. And I think the reason that he made this statement, whether he quoted or not, but the reason he made the statement that Assur is with these tribes dominating Western Europe is because he was witnessing this migration of the Assyrian people. They were conquering large areas of the west and also of the north. So clearly these historians that we had just discussed lived hundreds of years apart, and they document and believed themselves that the descendants of Assur could be found among these clans that were now in Europe dominating large areas. Religious scholar Herbert Armstrong researched the beginning of nations. He tracked the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and we find that he was right, and that they could be found in various European nations. But at the same time, Mr. Armstrong also found that the Assyrians, who were supposedly lost to history, could be found among the German and the Austrian people. The migration of the Assyrians was also noted by Herman Hay, who's a well-known, respected Church of God historian, but Herman Hay is actually looking up some of his work and those who quote him. He's cited by religious and secular historians, so he's well respected in the scholarly community. And he found the same thing, that the German people of today can be traced to the Assyrians of old. And there's a lot of information regarding the tribes of Germany, Germanic tribes that are numerous. Some are known as the Goths, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, meaning West Goths. There's the Franks and the Lombards and the Angles and the Saxons and the Vandals, and there's several others beside that. In the Roman Empire, interestingly, the Roman Empire under rule of the Caesars down unto the time of Christ, they referred to these people as Germania. Now, some define Germania as meaning a warlike people. I couldn't actually verify that that is the meaning of the term Germany or Germania. But in any case, because this was a term they used for several tribes that were dominating the area, this is indicative that these various clans or tribes, that they shared a brotherhood, that they actually were all one people, just, all part of a large family, if you will. And this is something that the tribes did not deny. They understood that they were related, and they worked together on many occasions. Revelation 13. Revelation chapter 13. But how did these tribes found in northwestern Europe, how did the Assyrians, if you will, become a part of the Roman Empire? Will Germany play a significant role in the end-time beast of Revelation? Well, anciently, the Roman Empire was divided into two regions, and this was portrayed by Daniel's interpretation. It's actually God's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream when he saw the image. And the image, we understand, pictured a head of gold, and this pictured the Babylonian Empire, and then there was a chest and arms of silver, and this represented the Medo-Persian Empire, and then they had thighs of bronze, which represented the Greek Empire, and then finally, at the bottom of this image, there were two legs of iron, and this represented the two regions of the Roman Empire, both the east and the west. But these legs also had toes, feet and toes that were clay, mixed with iron, meaning they weren't as strong as the legs, but they were still a part of the legs. They actually gave the legs stability, and these toes represented the various nations that would come under the rule of the Roman Empire, and even turn into the European nations that that are found in Europe today. That's Daniel 2, if you want to review it. But could it be that these two legs that is pictured in Nebuchadnezzar's image, or these two regions, are also reflected in the two sides of the beast, having both a religious and a political side? Because, much of the time these two sides of the beast were located both in the east and in the west. And that is what the revived beast found in the Holy Roman Empire became, this beast of John's vision, and became an alliance between church and state that continued to dwell in two regions of Europe. And so let's learn a little bit more about that for a moment. Revelation 13, I know it's a lot of information. I left out some things because there's actually more, but I kept the most pertinent and I think the most concrete information for the sermon. But Revelation 13, and beginning in verse 1, John stood on the sand of the sea, and he saw a beast rising up out of the sea. And the sea portrays what? People. It's people, nations. A beast rising up out of the nations, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Obviously, an ungodly beast or empire. So the beast which I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like the feet of a bear, his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. So the reason this beast is portrayed by, or is pictured by having parts of different animals is because it relates back to the 4 beasts of Daniel, where he saw these beasts that represented different empires down through time. Well, this final beast assimilated various parts of those empires and brought it under his control. And so that's why there are the various aspects of the leopard and the lion and the bear. And I saw one of the heads, one of these 7 heads in verse 3, as it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. So the 7 heads of this beast represent 7 empires or 7 eras of the Holy Roman Empire down through time. Now, one head was mortally wounded, seemed to, could not be revived, but it was revived. And this was revived when the Roman Empire fell. And it fell to what? It fell to a number of Germanic tribes who conquered the Roman Empire in the 5th century. The tribes that conquered the world's largest empire included tribes such as the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Franks, the Angles, the Saxons, and others. And after conquering the empire, we see that the deadly wound was healed, and the empire was restored after this under the rule of Justinian. The restoration became a 2-legged or 2-sided alliance between church and state. Revelation 17:3 prophesied that there is, you don't need to turn there, but it's definitely related to the beast, that prophesies that there is a woman that is riding this beast, and the woman and the beast are full of the names of blasphemy. And so we understand the symbolism of the woman in the scriptures. There are times when Revelation refers to a woman and it refers to the church of God, the true church, a faithful church. And then it also refers to a woman who is a harlot riding the beast. And it refers to a false church, a blasphemous church. And so Justinian aligned with this blasphemous organization, and the Roman Empire was revived, and it was then called the Holy Roman Empire because it was backed by a religious organization. And since that time, the beast has had various heads or eras of the empire. This began with Justinian. Another era was the era of Charlemagne. Then there was the era of Otto the Great. And then there was the era of the Habsburgs. And then after that came the Napoleonic era. And then after that became the fascist Axis powers. The seventh head or era is yet to come. And that's where we're headed in the sermon today. So do any of these eras that I had just mentioned, do any of them have a kinship with the German people? Well, we had learned earlier from several historians that Asher was found in Europe, was ravaging Europe, taking large portions to itself in these tribes. And we know that these tribes brought down the Roman Empire. And while Justinian, who was the individual who assisted in reviving this empire after it was mortally wounded, Justinian was not a descendant of the Germanic people, but the next heads of the beast were. The Frankish kingdom was a collection of Germanic people who were eventually supported by the Roman Catholic Church. Charlemagne was a pinnacle of the Frankish kingdom, and he became the second head or era of Revelation and the beast. And I quote, in 800 AD, this is one historian, this is well known, in 800 AD, Pope Leo III placed a crown on Charlemagne's head and declared him the 73rd ruler of the Fourth World Empire. So why would this Pope declare him a ruler, 73rd, of the Fourth World Empire? Well, I believe is because this Pope read the Scriptures, and he understood that the beasts that were spoken of by Daniel in chapter 7, that they represented 4 empires. And there was a fourth beast that was dreadful and terrible, exceedingly great, stamping the residue with its feet. And I think that this, what he had stated to Charlemagne when he crowned him, was acknowledging the fact that he knew that that was the Roman Empire that he was crowning him emperor of. Charlemagne, who was a German, he became the emperor of the Roman Empire. And some believe, and this is just a bit of a side, some believe that Charlemagne was not a German, even though it's kind of funny they believe that, but you'll see why in a minute. But even though he was a king of the Franks, which was a Germanic tribe, several Germanic tribes actually were included in the Franks. But the reason I think that some believe that he was not German, but in fact French, could be related to the name Frank or Franc, French and the Franks. And it's also because when his empire dissolved to a degree anyway, the western portion of his empire became France, and the eastern portion became Germany. And so I think many people like to think that Charlemagne was a Franc or a French individual, but that's really not the case. And going forward, the third head of the beast was under the era of Otto the Great. Now, nobody disputes that the Otto the Great was of German descent. And Otto had ruled the empire for nearly 40 years. He was crowned also by the Pope as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And for centuries following his rule, the kings would call themselves, the kings of Germany would call themselves Roman emperors of the German nation. There's the alliance. We see it, huh? One German history website states the following. It says that the Holy Roman Empire was a German empire that existed from 962 to 1806 in Central Europe. It was ruled by the Holy Roman Emperor. The Holy Roman Empire looked to Charlemagne, king of the Franks, as its founder, who had been crowned emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day in 800 by Pope Leo III. In 962, Otto I was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. And although the Roman imperial title was first restored to Charlemagne in 800, in a decree following the 1512 Diet of Cologne, which this is not our literal terms, Diet of Cologne sounds not too appetizing. But basically that's a term referring to a legislative body of the Holy Roman Empire. So in the 1512 Diet of Cologne, the name was officially changed to the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Other German emperors of the Roman Empire were the Habsburgs. Now, the royal house of Habsburgs was a dynasty, if you will, and it occupied the throne of the Roman Empire for nearly 300 years. So they were the fourth head of the beast. In 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte was crowned the fifth head of the beast. And Napoleon was thought to be a Frenchman, and he was ordained as emperor of the Roman Empire, and there is some speculation as to how the ordination went. Some say that because he was such a proud man and didn't believe his power came by his own might and strength, that when the Pope or bishop went to crown him, that he actually took the crown out of his hands and put it on himself. And it's like, I don't need nobody to crown me, I take it. Of course, that is speculation. It may be true, considering the individual that he was. But in any case, his era became the fifth head of the beast. Something I found interesting, though, is Napoleon, technically, he's not French. He's actually of Italian descent. But the German connection did not end with Napoleon. One author said this about the alliance between Germany and Rome that lasted nearly 1,500 years. He said, though the relations between German emperors and Catholic popes have not been without competition and struggle for supremacy, it's clear why the affair has endured the test of time. German emperors have always known that the road to world dominion goes through Rome. And equally so, the papacy has long known that the only way to forcefully spread its religion is to straddle the terrifying political beast wielding the sword. And I think that's very true. We can see history proves that those words are true. And so this sword-wielding alliance led to the slaughter of unknown numbers down through time. And of course, we know there was hundreds of thousands of individuals that were killed during the Crusades and also in the Inquisition that was led by the church in the Roman Empire. And during those events, true believers were killed, commandment keepers, simply because they were nonconformists to the Catholic Church. So the sixth era of the beast began in 1922, and this is kind of an interesting story. It began with Benito Mussolini, who was elected Italian Prime Minister. In 1925, Mussolini dropped all pretense of democracy, and he set up a legal dictatorship of Italy and Rome under a national fascist party. Mussolini began calling his regime at that time the Holy Roman Empire, and he was compelled. He felt that it was his destiny to conquer all weaker nations. On the 25th of October, 1936, an axis was declared between Italy and Germany was now under the leadership of Adolf Hitler at that time. So a brotherhood, we see, of fascism was formed between these two legs, if you will, of the beast. Neither Mussolini or Hitler were religious in the sense that they did not adhere to the Catholic faith, but Italy, we know, is home to the Vatican, to the church. And so the papacy, we see throughout the relationship with Benito Mussolini that they not only cooperated with Mussolini, but they actually supported him and endorsed him for more than a decade. And a quote from the Pope during that time actually said that Mussolini was a man of providence, meaning God sent or God led. In his book titled The Pope and Mussolini, David Kurtzer tells how these fascist rallies in Italy were held, and he said that they usually began with a morning mass that was celebrated by a priest at the time. And he says that churches and cathedrals were important props in the pageantry of fascism. We know they are quite beautiful, aren't they? You put a backdrop, that has a backdrop to this fascism that makes it appear like a holy movement or something righteous that is taking place. Mussolini himself was committed against the clerics, but both sides, this author, this historian wrote, benefited from the bargain or the alliance. On the other side, though, we have Adolf Hitler, right? Not a religious man at all. Or was he? What kind of religion was it that he may have practiced? Well, he didn't adhere to the Church of Rome. We know that. But there's a book, and I think it's in our church library, called Hitler's Pope. And it talks about the relationship between Hitler and the Catholic Church. And if you consider a few of the quotes, Hitler definitely had a religious tone to the propaganda that he spread. In 1926, Adolf Hitler said that Christ was the greatest early fighter in the battle against the world's enemy, the Jews. And he said that the work that Christ started but could not finish, I, Adolf Hitler, will conclude. See him putting himself in the place of the Messiah? Like Jesus started it, but he couldn't finish it. I'm going to finish it. Hitler also said that his fascist ideals, and I quote, he said, "We're not a movement, rather we are a religion. I'm going to become a religious figure," he said. And that he did, as he demanded that the subjects of the fascist empire that he built, that they pledge allegiance to him as, what was he called? Der Führer. And that term means a leader or a guide. Any scriptures come to mind? Don't call no man father. Call no man rabbi, your spiritual leader or guide. And I think this is him going directly against Christ's teachings, but putting himself in a similar place as the savior of Europe and the German people. On July 20th, 1933, a concordant between the Vatican and Hitler was signed, and the church agreed to keep priests and religion out of politics, while Hitler, among other things, granted complete freedom to confessional schools throughout the country. The Vatican was so appreciative of being recognized as a full partner that it asked God to bless the Reich. On a more practical level, it ordered German bishops to swear allegiance to the Nationalist Socialist regime. The new oath concluded with these significant words: "In the performance of my spiritual office and in my solicitude for the welfare and interest of the German Reich, I will endeavor to avoid all detrimental acts which might endanger it." In 1938, to show the German connection to the Holy Roman Empire, in 1938, Hitler ordered that the Roman Emperor's regalia be brought from Vienna. And this regalia included the imperial crown, the imperial orb, which is like a golden ball with a cross placed on top of it. I'm sure we've seen images of these. The scepter, and also the imperial sword. He demanded that they be brought to Nuremberg. And at the presentation of these symbols in this capital or chief city of Germany, he vowed that they would remain in Nuremberg forever. He indicated by these words that he intended for Germany to be the political power of the Holy Roman Empire forever. That was his intent. In Revelation 13, as wicked as Hitler was, the power that he amassed for his empire was not because of his own skill, cunning, or strength. There are numerous accounts, in fact, of individuals who had direct contact with him, who had conversations with this man, who heard him, who watched his speeches. They were mesmerized by his words, by his demeanor, and many have said by his eyes. Something about his eyes that captured them. Hitler was described by many as being masterful, eloquent, and said to be a man transformed while giving his speeches. And even some say that he seemed possessed, but not in a bad way, possessed to where he turned into a different man and sucked people into his words. So this man was clearly led, not by God, but by the adversary, by a great dragon. But Adolf, he had a choice, didn't he? God did not force him to choose evil, but evil is what he chose, and that caused him to have an alliance with the devil. In Revelation 13:2, talking about this beast, it says that he had a mouth like a lion, and the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. Now we know God owns everything. All the silver, all the gold, all the people, everything that has been created is God's. It's his possessions. But at this time, we also know God allows great authority to take place that is not of him, that he has allowed some people to be in control, and he has allowed the devil actually to have a type of authority over the earth. He'll only let him go so far, but he allows him to do quite a bit. And so Satan, the point is, Satan is the inspiration behind the wicked thrones of tyranny and also behind the unholy, if you will, Roman Empire. Daniel in chapter 8. Daniel 8. The power behind the throne was also noted by the prophet Daniel, who spoke of this same end-time beast. And in verse 23 of Daniel in chapter 8, verse 23, it says, "In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes," or practices sinister schemes. "His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power." Why? Because Satan is the power behind these wicked thrones. It says, "He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive, and he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people." So this is a twofold prophecy here, that Antiochus Epiphanes was a type of the end-time beast. And what Daniel is saying took place in a form. But this is going to be fulfilled completely at the end, because the last head of the beast has yet to arise. And this individual will also be an eloquent speaker, mesmerizing. He'll charm people into being convinced that he is a type of Messiah who is sent by God to save the world. But he's not given power by God. It's only allowed. God allows it to happen. He's instead given power by the dragon. In verse 25, "Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart, thinking he's something great, a savior. He shall destroy many in their prosperity, and he shall even rise against the prince of princes," talking about rising up even in defiance against God, against the return of the Messiah. And this is directly, if you put a note here and look it up, Revelation 19, verses 19 and 20, talks about this very moment where the end-time beast is going to try to fight against very God. But it says in the end of verse 25, "He shall be broken without human means." And it's because he's going to be broken by God. Oh, you want to fight? It's pointless, futile to fight against God. And I think this was pointed out in the reading today. I think this is perhaps the most convincing evidence relating who the German people are. They have produced many emperors of the Roman Empire for nearly 1,500 years, and so the possibility of the German and Assyrian people having an individual on the throne of the empire once again is very high. But this can be known also through other prophecies. Let's look at Nahum. I know it's a lot of information, and I'm almost finished. Nahum in chapter 1. You know, we went through the book of Nahum in our Bible studies a while back, and that book we saw is vastly a prophecy about Nineveh. But Nineveh was a queen city of who? Assyria. And therefore, this was a prophecy against the Assyrian Empire. But this book, Nahum, as well as many other end-time prophecies, puts Babylon in the same context. And it reaches actually beyond the ancient city of Nineveh. In Nahum 1, in verse 1, we see that this begins with a burden against Nineveh. This was written some 150 years after Jonah's prophecy. And then in verse 9, it says, "What do you conspire against the Eternal? He will make an utter end of it. affliction will not rise up a second time. In other words, the destruction will be complete. Well, was the destruction of those people complete at the time? Well, it was thorough, but they did rise up, didn't they? They rose up again in the different heads of the beast. But God says in the future, the destruction will not rise up again. Or I should say, these people will not rise up again. In verse 13 of chapter 2, it says, "Behold, I am against you, says the Eternal of hosts. I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions," referring to young warriors or fierce individuals. "I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall not be heard anymore." What messages? The voice of what messengers? Sending out messages that, hey, here's the new Messiah, the beast of Revelation, the great man. Listen to him speak. Look at the miracles that are being worked, being supported by a blasphemous organization. Those are the types of messages that are going to go out over the airwaves, over the internet, all over the world when the beast rises up once again. Nahum in chapter 3 and verse 3. Let's go partway down here. It says, "There's a multitude of slain, a great number of bodies, countless corpses. They stumble over the corpses because of the multitude of the harlotries of the seductive harlot, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations through her harlotries and families through her sorceries." So again, we see God tying in this empire to a great harlot, a woman that rides the beast. If you turn over just one book, a few pages, to Habakkuk chapter 2, and in verse 8. "Because you have plundered many nations, all the remnant of the people shall plunder you, because of men's blood and the violence of the land and of the city, and all who dwell in it." Again, this is talking about that empire at the end coming down. A duality, of course, in the prophecies. It happened once, but it is going to be even more thorough and on a much larger scale at the end. Zephaniah, if you go over just another page or two, Zephaniah 2 and verse 11. Again, this is directly referring to the end time, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. Verse 11, chapter 2, "The Eternal will be awesome to them," or terrible, if you will, "for he will reduce to nothing all the gods or fake gods of the earth. People shall worship him, each one from his place. Indeed, all the shores of the nations." This is obviously referring to Christ's return. And then he goes on to say, "You Ethiopians also, you shall be slain by my sword, and he will stretch out his hand against the north, destroy Assyria, and make Nineveh a desolation as a dry wilderness." Well, when this prophecy was written, Nineveh had already been laid waste. So God was telling something that was going to happen. He's saying, well, it's still going to happen. And it's because of the symbolism and him relating back to where those people came from Nineveh and from Assyria and even from Assur, a son of Shem. So God understood that the people of Assyria would become key players in the rise of different eras of the beast. The destruction of Nineveh occurred in 612 BC, but the entire fulfillment of Babylon's fall is yet to come. In fact, when we read through many prophecies about Babylon that include Nineveh and the Assyrians, we see that this duality in the prophecy is clear, and it reflects what is going to occur at the end of the age. Daniel 8, once again, if you go back a few pages. When God uses specific names of people or places, it's because, and then those people have long gone or seem to have disappeared or no longer live, it's because those places and those people reflect a place or a people that are players in future events. Now, Genesis 10 and Genesis 11 that we had began with, these are genealogies of nations, and they are referred to. These nations are referred to throughout the Bible. And other people are mentioned as well as they come into contact with the nation of Israel. the prophecies of a coming tribulation that is led by the final head of the beast, this is referred to in Jeremiah 30 and verse 7 as a time of Jacob's trouble. And Daniel wrote that the beast, in verse 24, he shall destroy, chapter 8 and verse 24, his power shall be mighty, but not by his power, and he shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive, and he shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. And then if you'd look over, what is he talking about here? Of chapter 12 of Daniel in verse 7, the holy people. Then I heard, verse 7 of chapter 12, I heard a man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river as he held up his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it shall be for a time and for a time, times and half a time, when the power of the holy people has been completely shattered, all these things shall be finished. And so the holy people are going to be affected greatly by the beast. It's talking about God's people. It's talking about Church of God people, about faithful, or perhaps maybe not so faithful, individuals. You see, the beast will seek to conquer the nations, yes, but he will also seek to persecute true believers. And it's because of this inspiration of the dragon. You know, Satan knows God's plan. He knows what's going on with the people of God, both physical and spiritual Israelites. And so he's going to seek to persecute those individuals. And when some are taken to a place of safety for 3.5 years, we see what happens when the beast realizes, oh, it can't get to those people. What does God do? God swallows up the armies that chase after, that go after those people. And then the beast turns to those individuals who have the testimony or the commandments of God. Chapter 12 of Revelation and verse 17, the dragon was enraged with the woman when he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments or have the commandments of God and the testimony of Christ. And so this time of Jacob's trouble, it includes believers, commandment keepers. It refers to people who have the commandments of God, but it's my understanding, and I think it's the understanding of most of the churches of God, that the reason the beast is allowed to persecute a number of unbelievers a number of believers who are not taken to a place of safety is because although they have the commandments of God, it's a matter of how are they keeping the commandments of God. Oh, they know what they are, but how are we keeping them? Are we keeping them faithfully? And so the beast turns to persecute such individuals. But this time of Jacob's trouble is also physical. It's not just spiritual Israelites. It also refers to spiritual Israelites, that is, the nations that are descendants of Jacob, meaning descendants of Israel. It will be a time of trouble for the lost tribes of Israel that includes the Jews. It includes the nations of Britain and America, of Denmark, of Sweden or Norway, and others. And so these will be a target of the end-time beast. Psalm 83, I told you we were going to end here. And so here we go. Psalm 83. This psalm is a song crying out to God to protect his faithful people. But much of this psalm is also prophetic. In Psalm 83, and beginning in verse 1, Asaph writes, "Do not keep silent, O God. Do not hold your peace, and do not be still, O God. For behold, your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people, and consulted together against your sheltered ones." Some translations say the hidden ones. So it could be it's referring to they're taking counsel against those who are in a place of safety, or it could be those people that are, it's not known exactly where these people are today, but it will be known at the end who the true church of God is, who the faithful people of the church of God are. They have said, if you continue in verse 4, they have said, "Come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be remembered no more." They want to cut them off from being a people or a nation. So the names, nobody remembers even the name. This is reminiscent of Daniel 11, verse 40, where the king of the south will come down, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through, and enter the glorious land. Many countries will be overthrown, Daniel said, but these shall escape from his hand: Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. And so you're going to see these names mentioned in just a moment. Is the beast simply one man or one nation? Well, it's led by a man, and it's, might be led by a nation, but it has a confederacy of nations that give it power, that give it validity and strength. And this is portrayed by the 10 horns that are shown in the beast of Revelation. And it's rode by a harlot who also gives the beast validity and raises it up in the minds and in the eyes of the world. In verses 5 through 8, they have consulted together, speaking of different nations. They have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy against you. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gebal, Ammon and Amalek, Philistia, with the inhabitants of Tyre. Assyria has also joined with them, and they have helped the children of Lot. So the image of Nebuchadnezzar's dream had 2 legs, portraying the Roman Empire. The empire consists of 2 sides, east and west, but also political and religious. These legs are supported by 10 toes that are not as strong as the empire itself, but they give it stability. And this is pictured by a collection of nations. The beast of Revelation has 10 horns. That pictures these 10 nations that will support and give power to the beast. Now, interestingly, this list of nations here that we had just read that desire to annihilate Israel are 10. Assyria is listed as being one of them, and also those nations that are protected, as Daniel states, are in this list: Moab, Ammon, and Assyria. These nations will escape the wrath from the beast, but they will not escape the wrath of God. And so the evidence presented, it might be a little complex in some ways. I tried to make it a bit simplified. It does support the theory that Germany today consists of the Assyrian people of yesterday. This does not mean, though, that all German people are evil, because it's a choice. People have a choice to choose between good and evil, right and wrong, iniquity, or a righteous law-abiding life. But God knew that these people, given a choice, that they would play a key role in the rise and the fall of the Holy Roman Empire.